Hi, this is Kevin from Paradise Found Studio, and thanks for joining us. Today we're going to be taking a bit of a different approach. Instead of getting into the visual arts and talking to a visual artist, we're going to be talking to a Christian author and talking about her book series. Corinna, thanks for joining us today.
It's great to be here today.
So Corinna is Oxford trained, and she's been nominated for the Carnegie Medal Award, and she largely writes faith-based fiction. And she targets young adults and teens. And since I don't quite fit that demographic, we're bringing in Emily Pawlowski. She's my niece and my goddaughter. So Emily, thanks for joining the party.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
So today we're going to be discussing Corinna's 7-book series called I Am Margaret. Corinna, can you please give us an overview of the book?
The I Am Margaret series is a dystopian series set in the future. There's 2 big themes in the books. There's Christian persecution, because the society has become completely atheist, the government, the totalitarian atheist government. And the second theme is eugenics. So things have sort of gone fairly much in the direction they're already moving, but they've gone to the extreme. So the teenagers all get tested when they're 18, and if they're not perfect enough, then they get sent for use as forcible organ donation, basically. And the main character is called Margaret, hence I Am Margaret. And she's sort of in double trouble because she's a Christian, and she's also pretty sure she's going to fail her sorting because she's dyscalculic.
Let me expand a little bit on that. So the sorting, basically, so when somebody is sorted, they are either put into the group where they can be a productive part of society. If they're not part of that group, they're put into a camp, and eventually they're going to be taken apart for parts, right? For the people that are living the good life. Does that sound about right?
Yep, that's about right, yeah.
Emily, you got any questions?
This is like a very intense book. So kind of what was your inspiration to go with this sort of like eugenic dystopian society?
There were 3 main influences kind of came together. So there was the life of Sir Margaret Clitheroe, who was an Elizabethan martyr. The Hunger Games, the book, it was actually from my dissatisfactions with the book. All the characters basically played the game that the government wanted them to play. They didn't sort of say, no, this is wrong, I'm not playing. And also, another set of dissatisfactions that went into the book, I saw the film version of Never Let Me Go, and I should say I haven't read the book, so this might not apply to the book. But in the film version, it seemed, there were 2 things that just seemed totally unrealistic to me, one of which was that no one tried to escape. They all just went along with it, and there didn't seem to be even any thought of escape, or who did you about that person elsewhere who tried to escape. There was just no idea of a escape, and that doesn't really fit with my understanding of human nature. Other thing that was totally unrealistic was that the government had gone to all the expense of raising these clones from childhood and all that, and then they were only taking like 2 or 3 organs from each one, and I just thought that wouldn't happen. So some slightly unpleasant practical points kind of went into I Am Margaret, but the main idea did come from a dream when I was on retreat at a convent, and I had the dream for the main sort of plot line.
Well, what's interesting about that, you've got, in the Catholic Church, there's certainly a lot of discussion of the right to life and some of the objections to in vitro fertilization and some other things. And it seems like you're taking some of these issues to the extreme, and it kind of puts a little bit of light on why there's a concern in the first place.
That's exactly it, really. I think quite often dystopias are a warning about something that the author can see could go very wrong in the future. So yes, it is. I often say it's a warning about the logical end point of the culture of death, or to be more accurate, it's a possible end point, because there are certain things I don't really follow up and go into, and I don't really go into euthanasia, because the whole point in their society is that they get all the organs they want to live as long as they want. And actually, I think even in the time since I wrote the book, I think euthanasia is looking more likely to be a big issue.
And you don't get into cloning. That's certainly could play into it, right? Not just camps, but then farming.
I just focused on sort of a couple of possible problems rather than sort of trying to throw them all in. And I have sort of touched on human genetic manipulation in another book, which is called Mandy Lamb and the Full Moon. I just touch on it sort of gently in that, because it's about a half sheep girl, or technically a 95% human with 5% sheep. Makes her a bit woolly and sheepish sometimes.
So in your books, there's parts where you really get quite descriptive or really dwell upon some really upsetting topics. Why did you choose to get so in depth on this?
I didn't want to sort of just sort of skate over it. I didn't want to make it so like graphic in a detailed physical sense that people were really it's not necessary to get into like real physical details. People always imagine it at the level of their own imagination. So the better your imagination, the worse it's actually going to be, because it's mostly got across from the reactions of the characters, and it is quite intense. I think the point is it's supposed to be kind of significant, and it's not really. I think the scenes that you're thinking of particularly, if you didn't take it seriously, it would kind of be wrong, really.
It seems kind of allegorical. You got Saint Bartholomew. He was skinned alive, and so the scene we're talking about, not to get too much detail, but someone was actually taken apart for parts. Someone that was real close to the main character. Very intense scene, as Emily mentioned. So is this intended to be an allegory for the early Christian church?
To the extent that it is dealing very much with Christian persecution, yes, but I was actually basing it more on the sort of recusant period in Elizabethan England, where people were hung, drawn and quartered. Margaret Clitheroe, she was actually crushed to death. They put a sharp rock under her back, then they put a door on her, and then they piled rocks on her. So it is kind of based on real history.
Obviously, your book has a very Christian, especially Catholic slant, but there is this fear that authors often have, that I've noticed, of making your book too Christian and like shoving it down readers' throats. So how do you sort of like walk that line and give them your message without forcing it upon people?
Well, I was writing mainstream books, pretty much entirely secular, before I wrote I Am Margaret, and I got rather fed up with it because it felt very unnatural. It felt very forced. It was like you had to keep God out of it or no one would want to read it, So I got a bit fed up with that. And when I had the idea for I Am Margaret, I just thought, I'm just going to write this book exactly as I would write a mainstream book, but I'm just going to have the faith in there. So the faith just comes through the characters' thoughts, and it's just integral. It's integral to the plot, it's integral to the characters, it's integral to their decision making. So it's not kind of forced in. No one's doing something they wouldn't have done just because I want to shove a bit of faith in. So I think that's the thing. It just needs to be integral, really.
As you said, a lot of your characters have this faith, they have these Christian motivations, but Margaret's fiance, Bane, is not a believer. Why did you choose to make him not a Christian, at least at first? I haven't read the rest of the books.
It was partly because, as I said, I was trying to just write a book as though it was like a completely mainstream book, but with the faith in. So, I suppose it's the fact that you don't have to be, you can be agnostic and you can still see that something's wrong and you should fight against it. So Bane is obviously very against and very supportive of Margot, even though he doesn't entirely understand her faith.
You sort of flirt with the idea of a love triangle, I guess you could say. You have this other character, John. Obviously, in young adult books, when you have two male characters and a female character, everyone's going to assume there's a love triangle. And you do sort of like have these moments where they're like worried about getting too close.
And I found it threw me off balance, which is great for me when I'm reading. I like to be surprised, and it kind of threw me off balance a little bit because you weren't following the normal tropes.
What were some challenges you faced while trying to write this relationship between the two characters?
What I wanted was to have these characters in a situation where everyone would kind of expect they were going to fall in love, maybe even get quite physical, because you don't have to. You can make a decision that you're going to stand by what you believe in and not get into that situation, especially if you're already in love with someone else.
Could you tell us a bit about your writing process? Writing series especially can be pretty difficult. So how do you plan out your book?
Well, it was one book when I wrote it. I didn't think it was going to be a series to start with. I wasn't even sure at times what was going to happen in that last intense scene. It could have gone a different way. But I kind of wanted it to be a series because if it had stopped there, it would have been a bit, well, not exactly depressing depending on how it was written, but anyway, a bit depressing. The second and third books developed very quickly. I think by the time I'd finished writing book one, I had the second and third books in my head, and I wrote those. At one point, I kind of thought that might be it, but there was a character who refused to die. He kind of demanded that there be a fourth book, and also the series wasn't really finished after book. Then I did Margot's diary, which was just sort of let people know some of the things that happen after, various things that people would like to see resolved in various ways. I thought I was finished again, but then I wrote this little novella called Brothers, which is a prequel, and then I thought that was just going to be one thing, but then Kyle kind of took off as a character, so then we had The Siege of Reginald Hill, which comes after all of the rest of the books and is kind of a pair to Brothers in many ways. So yes, and there's going to be a sort of a long novella and short story book coming out sometime this year.
One of the things that struck me when you were explaining this, okay, you're saying Margaret was in a bad situation. I'm not going to give it too much away, but she was in a serious situation. Now, of course, as a reader, I know there's a lot of books after it, so yeah, you know she's going to get through it. But as you were writing it, did you not know that?
But by the time I wrote the scene, I certainly knew how it was going to end. But when the book was developing in my head, I didn't know initially. There was a possibility it would all end rather differently. Like that, the same thing with The Siege of Reginald Hill. I won't tell you how that would get, but there were kind of two ways it could go, and very nearly went the other way.
Corinna, thanks a lot for your time today.
It's great to be here today.
And Emily, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Thanks for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed this like I did. If you did, please hit like, and we're trying to build our subscriber base, so please hit subscribe and you'll get a regular feed. We do these every other week so you can keep up with what we're doing. Thanks.